This week on the LowDOWN, a Down syndrome podcast, LSS Teacher Sam Leach gives us a lowdown on thriving in elementary school. Over to you, Hannah and Marla.
Hi, everybody. This is Hannah, co-host of the LowDOWN podcast. I'm here today with my co-host Marla for an in-depth look at elementary schooling, its benefits and challenges for kids with Down syndrome and other families. Starting school is a huge milestone for any child, and this is no different for kids with Down syndrome. However, the process of getting started, gaining momentum, and making education successful is a more hands-on task for kids with Down syndrome and their families. Families often start coming to therapy in the preschool years, and a big reason for that is making school entry more smooth and successful.
Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to a learning support services teacher here in a local school district. We will take a look at some common challenges for elementary-aged kids in school, as well as some strategies that can make school life positive and full of growth. Let's welcome Mr. Leach to the LowDOWN podcast. Hi there, Mr. Leach.
Good afternoon. Hey,
Hello.
nice to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here on the podcast. Before we get started, we have this little surprise that we give to all of our guests, and we have a few secret questions that we would like to ask you so that our listeners can get to know you a little bit. Are you ready for those?
Fabulous. Yep, go ahead.
All right. So first, what are you reading right now?
I'm actually reading 3 or 4 different books at the same time, trying to keep myself busy. And I'm reading a fantasy book called Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb.
Oh.
Ooh,
Yeah.
Sounds interesting.
It's fantastic.
Question number 2, Mr. Leach, what is your de-stress routine?
My de-stress routine is to go for a long, long run in nature.
How long are we talking?
As long as possible. Marathon distance or longer on trails is the best way for me.
Oh, wow. That's
long. Yeah.
That's lengthy. Question number 3, are you a coffee or a tea person?
I've switched to coffee more recently. I did go through a tea phase and got very into especially black and white teas, but now I'm firmly in the coffee camp, 2 to 3 cups a day.
Yeah, well, I think most of us will join you there, although Hannah does prefer her hot chocolates.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Do you have a go-to workout playlist that you like?
I think I'd probably go classic rock, AC/DC, Rolling Stones, anything with a good paced beat, especially for the aforementioned running.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, right.
AC/DC is great for running.
Yeah.
Really powers you up for sure.
Back in Black, Highway to Hell, all of those.
Yes, exactly.
And last but not least of our secret questions, if you were an animal, which animal would you be?
Wow. I think I'd probably go with something avian, probably an eagle. Something where I could get a bit of perspective and get to, practice my social distancing from way, way, way up high.
Very effective.
Very effective. Yeah. I love that. An eagle. That's super cool. Yeah.
Well, thanks for indulging us in those questions. I feel like people that are listening will feel like they know you a little bit better now for sure. So could you tell us a little bit about your professional journey and how you ended up as an LSS teacher?
Absolutely. So I am, I guess I'm a second generation teacher. My mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and my mother was a special needs teacher. And I spent a lot of time from an early age, whenever, I had a Pro D day, I would be at my mum's school. So I had pretty good exposure to students with learning exceptionalities and learning needs. I then, once I'd finished university, I was kind of unsure of what direction to take. And using that kind of experience I'd had in my mother's school, I became an EA at a school for children on the autistic spectrum. And I knew that was a route or path that I felt passionately about. And I wanted to have more impact or more creative decisions about the curriculum that I was teaching. So then I retrained and became a teacher. And then I taught in a couple of separated special needs schools, taught in different countries where they have different systems, and then eventually made my way to BC, where they run, and across Canada, they run more of a mainstream integrated approach.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a journey that you've been on. Do you feel like it helps you being an LSS teacher now? Do you feel like you have a different understanding of what it's like to be an education support person, like an EA, having already gone through that sort of career path yourself?
I'd like to think so. I think having been an EA and then having to work closely with other educational support staff, I like to think that I have a window into what their job entails,
Mm-hmm.
the successes and challenges that they face day to day. And I also have worked in different classrooms where the actual ratio of students to adults is quite different. And I think that changes the relationship of the teacher to EAs as well. If you're working with 8 children and there's only 2 adults in the room, it's quite different from having one EA assigned to one child in a mainstream classroom of, say, 20 to 23 children. But yeah, I do think that the manner in which I've kind of arrived at this position is, I've been very lucky to have experienced a number of different settings, and I feel like I can bring that to the table.
It must be valuable to have those different experiences, being in kind of like a leadership role that you are now too, because you're able to better guide some of the teachers and SEAs that you work with, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge with, I don't know if management is the right term for it, but just in terms of how do we meet the needs of our students best is about getting everyone on the same page, and
Mm-hmm.
actually realizing that because everyone comes from different backgrounds and different even educational pedagogies, depending on how they were taught, it's really important to actually, when you're bringing everyone to the table, getting everyone to connect in and be like, well, this is how I think, and this is why I think about this, and this is why I focus on this. In the same way that, the way an SLP or OT would look at a challenge or a stretch for a student would be very different because of where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So I think making sure that all the participants know their responsibilities, but I think also know their strengths. I've seen the relationship between EAs and teachers work very well, and also very differently across different settings.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, Mr. Leach, can you talk a little bit about the Iep process and what is it for? And for our listeners, can you just talk about what Iep is?
Absolutely. So an IEP is an individual educational plan, and an IEP really is a specific set of goals and targets for a student that has a designated learning exceptionality. I use the term learning exceptionality. I prefer it to learning disability. The term itself has changed. I see it as learning exceptionality as there are exceptions in the way that the students learn. I find it also encompasses a full range of students. That's why I like to use it. So really the IEP it's saying, what are we doing above and beyond what we're already providing in the classroom? How are we going beyond to meet the needs of the student? And then the specific needs are usually specified. So for example, or we might call them a stretch. So the student has a stretch in, for example, mobility, gross motor or fine motor. And then it will be, okay, so how are we going to meet this stretch? Or the student might have a stretch in communication. So how are we going to meet the stretch? But also IEPs do focus on positives as well. So we talk of areas of strength and areas of stretch. It's not just areas of stretch, but it's a place where the classroom teacher, the learning support teacher, the principal, any educational assistants and parents can come together and talk, really trying to get a holistic picture of the student. I think there's also an element of creating accountability to make sure that if we document what the student needs in the IEP, we can then check back on that throughout the year and review their progress.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I love it's a relatively newer way of looking at strengths and challenges, the strengths and stretches thing. That's a relatively newer term or terminology that's being used. And I have to say, I also love your take on learning exceptionalities. I think it is a little bit more inclusive and all encompassing. So I love that idea too. So with respect to an IEP, are IEPs meant to have academic goals, safety goals, self-care goals, or all of these? Like, from your perspective, what kind of goals should be included?
I think that IEPs really should give as much information as possible. I personally believe that the more information that is shared, the more that we can benefit the students that we work with. If, let's just say, for example, there was a student that was struggling in a certain area, and then it only came to light later that they had a specific challenge in math, but that wasn't shared, then that changes the focus of the work that everyone is doing with the student. So for me, an IEP is really, what are the students' needs? And that means it could be personal care, it could be academic goals, it could be communication goals, it could be independence or personal awareness. So it really is quite a myriad of different things. It's all the things really that make us who we are, make a person who they are. I think that, thinking about the types of clients you'd have at the DSRF, I think that there is not a set pro forma in the sense of, if a student is known to have Down syndrome, they need to have a communication goal, they need to have a physical goal, they need to, there's nothing along those lines. It's more what are the needs. So we have some students that would have an IEP that have no communication goals, no physical goals. They literally just have regulation goals. So when they're upset or frustrated, they would have a goal of what to do. Whereas we have other students that have like multiple objectives in each goal. So the goal would be like the general heading of like physical independence or communication. And then within each of those, there could be 3 or 4 objectives for the student to work on. 3 or 4 starts to be quite a lot. And I've had a lot of conversations with people over the number of objectives that you actually set in an IEP over the course of a year. That's something we can talk about later.
And then you mentioned parents as being a part of the IEP process. So what would you recommend parents bring to this kind of meeting, and how can they get the most out of an IEP meeting?
I think if parents can bring as much information as possible, whether that's, psych eds, psychoeducational assessments that have been done in the past, even anecdotals of things that they've noticed with their child, the more information they can bring is better. And really the parents are a partner in this process. So we want to say, okay, so what language are you using at home when your child is frustrated? Oh, okay. What are you doing? What expertise can you share with us so that we can better meet the students' needs at school? So in terms of documentation, I mean, even things like simple stuff like writing samples, or I personally find videos fantastic, because videos really give you a chance to see quite a lot. And even something like a writing sample, if someone's written something, a student's written something, you can look at it and say, okay, was this independent, or was it hand over hand, or was it a partial physical prompt? Whereas if you're looking at a video, you can see clearly, oh, okay, well, actually the adult just gave them the pen and then they were able to write it. Great. So yeah, I'm a big fan of, and sharing videos with parents as well, throughout the year. Just a quick video, I feel like speaks, a picture paints 1,000 words, but I really think a video goes even further, because you can then see the progress. So yeah, video evidence, if parents can bring that along, is excellent. Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit pushed to the side, but I think the interest of the student, for so many of our students, their interest is the thing that's going to take them the furthest in terms of how deep they'll delve into a subject. If you say, okay, we're going to be looking at 14th century Italy, I can imagine some students would say great, and some students would say I'm not that interested in it. But if you said, okay, we're actually going to be looking at trains, and we are going to look at trains through the ages, and we're going to look at the differences between trains, and we're going to look at comparisons, and I can imagine that you'd get a lot of students that would be clamoring, and they'd probably be teaching you a few things about the trains.
For sure.
But I think that bringing that interest piece, what does your child love to do? What is important to them? And one of the things as well with the IEP process that I like is now, and this is coming from Ministry of Education, now we're actually beginning to write the IEPs in the student's language. So it's I can statements, as opposed to the name of the person, Jimmy can, it's I can, with the idea that we're really coaching it in the student's language and thinking about how would they describe it. So yeah, for me, past past videos about what the student can achieve, stuff about their motivation. The more information parents can bring is fantastic.
Fantastic. That's so great that you're open to parents bringing that information and kind of being open to viewing your student in a holistic perspective. Like, what are their interests? What are their strengths, so that you can use those to help teach them in the classroom. So I think that's so fantastic that you're focusing on those things. Often our students, are assigned one-to-one support in the school day. And as Marla can probably also agree, we have lots of contact with the one-to-one school support and how our kiddos are doing. Mm-hmm. Given that this relationship is so important, what steps can families take to make sure it's a successful working relationship?
I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is down to expectation and about looking at, the school's policy, the district's policy about the relationship between the support staff and the parents. For example, I know that in some schools, parents are sending videos directly to the educational staff and the staff sending back to parents, whereas in other schools, it's the classroom teacher that is doing that. So it can look different in different places. I think it's important that the expectations are very clear, so that, okay, we will be communicating once a month, or we'll be communicating once a week, or we'll be sending a video twice a week, so that people are sure exactly kind of where they stand. I think in terms of ensuring that the child is working with someone that they really feel like respects them, I think that's a lot of the way in which the child talks about going to school. Like, we have one student and he literally skips off the bus, and it's like, okay, if you're skipping off the bus to school, we know you're looking forward to your day. And I think that taking the child's lead on that is very, very key. I think that the clear expectations is important. So not putting too much on the support staff, and making sure that the classroom teacher is involved, and making sure, if the classroom teacher is actually communicating with parents, then allow that to happen, rather than having the staff member do that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So, who should parents talk to if they feel that student EA relationship needs some help? Because I've seen a few of those situations where parents are kind of stuck and don't know what pathway to take to figure that situation out.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's for a lot of parents, for all parents that want their child to receive the best when they're at school. They want to feel like their days are purposeful and it's time well spent. I would, in my opinion, I would always seek out the administrator, so the principal or the whoever is in charge at school. Mm-hmm. It's always worth having the learning support teacher involved, someone that was in my role. I think that the learning support teacher works alongside the EAs and helps with their schedules, but in terms of more of the assigning of EAs to specific students, that's really the principal is responsible for that, but in collaboration with the district. So it ends up being a kind of a multi-layered approach. It's not one person at the school that just says, you're going with them, you're going with them, you're going with them. It's based on the school's needs and the staff that are available and the expertise of the staff that are available. I think being open to it and using, making sure that, people are positive in their interactions. I know for myself that I've sometimes spoken to teachers, and teachers feel like the EAs should just be dealing with the student. And my take is always, well, actually, it's very challenging for a lot of the educational support staff, because when they're given a student that may have some aggressive and challenging behavior, they're given, they're not given a lot of prep time in order to actually adapt any of the material. And actually, technically, it's not their role to adapt the material that should be done for them. So they're given a very short period of time to adapt content for a student with very high needs. So I like to think that the EAs are under quite a lot of pressure, and often taking that as the first, not necessarily point of call, but just the first perspective. Like, these are members of staff that are working very hard for the children, kind of would then guide the interaction with them, as opposed to thinking, oh, this member of staff maybe isn't doing enough for my child. Or
exactly. And I think that's such an important point you bring up, because I think from our perspective as therapists that don't necessarily work at the school system directly, it's good to know how the administration has things set up, and like you were mentioning, how a lot of the EAs may not have enough time to prep or to really get used to a particular student before they're kind of thrown in there. It's a good thing for us to know too, because a lot of the times I'm wondering like, oh, how can the EA act this way? How come they don't know about this thing? And it's because it's just they are under a lot of pressure and they do have a lot on their plate, and it's just a matter of, you know, not being prepared enough or not having enough time to be prepared for that. So that's a really good perspective to have for sure.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that,
mm-hmm.
you know, talking a little bit about like my experience of how I've kind of got to the role, and people are often like, oh wow, that's like, I've never heard of that resource, but
mm-hmm.
it was only the benefit of me being in a previous setting where they
Absolutely.
use that source a lot, you know.
Yeah.
So for example, anyone who's worked with POPARD, which is the provincial outreach for autism related disorders,
mm-hmm.
their experience and their skill set will be much more specified than someone that hasn't.
Yeah.
And you might meet someone who's worked for them and be like, wow, you know, and it will blow your mind.
Absolutely.
But not everyone has been lucky enough to have access to that training or those resources.
Yeah. Marla, did you have anything to add to that at all as well?
It's really interesting to hear you describe how the organization within a school is set up, because I think people do assume that it is a clear hierarchy and that the EA answers to this person and this person answers to that person. And therefore, if I talk to this person, let's say it's the principal or whatever, then they're going to make sure that whatever I need is done. And that's not how it works in reality. Largely, it seems like due to just the pure shortage of having enough staff to meet everybody's needs, and staff that have specific training, say from POPARD or from a different organization, and have had time to go and pursue those other resources. So yeah, there's a lot to consider in it. However,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, however, for parents that do feel like the relationship or the dyad between their particular child and whoever's supporting them at school, if that does need some help, then seeking out assistance for that is not a bad thing to do. It's not wrong to go and talk to somebody at school, and certainly nothing can be fixed if you don't say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And phrasing it in that sense of how can we improve versus these are the things that are wrong.
I don't like this. Yeah.
And I think it's also really important to mention, you're talking about like how EAs are assigned. We have really two levels of EA. There is EA and there's EA3. And an EA3 has received 1,000 hours of training alongside a behavioral analyst. So there are only two types of EA. So when you're thinking about, okay, well, who's assigned to my child? If your child, usually someone with an ASD diagnosis and challenging behavior, would have an EA3. So they've had more help on functional behavioral assessments and the ABA method. But your child really could be assigned anyone that meets the requirements of being an EA and has been accepted into the post. So it's not as though there are different levels of EA, you know, oh, this EA is a specialist in, they might be a specialist in working with students with Down syndrome, but there's not a category of that within the system.
It's good to know. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Mr. Leach, you know, the term inclusion has become quite popular, and rightfully so. A lot of people are paying attention to this now. How can you reframe the concept of inclusion for parents who think it's kind of an all or nothing process? Is there a middle ground? How would you view that?
I think the way that I view it is quite unique. It was funny, I've just been reading about this week, but I came across quite a good description in a course text I was reading, and they were talking about integration as the physical process versus inclusion being the theoretical underpinnings. Really, inclusion is the ideas that we have around it, whereas integration is what does that look like when I walk into the school? Where is the student sitting? How are they interacting with their peers? For me, personally, I agree that inclusion is a way we think about things. But I've also, I've spent a number of years in what would be classed as segregated settings, in classes specifically for students with learning exceptionalities. And I think those often get kind of penalized for being uninclusive. For me, the real question is, does it benefit the student? And if you cannot answer yes to that question, then you're not helping the student. So for example, people might say, oh, well, my child is getting removed from the class so they can work one-to-one with someone. Well, is it benefiting them in order to work one-to-one with that person? Yes. Great.
Yeah.
Or would it benefit them more to stay in and be part of community circle for that session? Yes, then do that. I think that it can get very, very difficult to separate when you start to wade into what is inclusion. I think it's very easy to say we should always include. Yes, but the actual fact of things is we need to make sure that we're meeting our students' needs.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting you bring that up. We've had the pleasure of speaking with Sue Robbins, who's a parent and a writer about ableism and inclusion and health and person first kind of language and policy. And one thing that she was able to bring to our discussion was this idea of parent grief, which is a really long process. And for her own story, she felt that one of the reasons that she pushed inclusion and complete inclusion so much when her son was younger was partially her own grief and not wanting to be different and not wanting to be other. And I can see that mirrored in a lot of the families that I work with, especially when the kids are younger and getting started in school. And there's a great leeriness towards pulling the child out of the classroom for any reason, thinking that that might, not benefit them and cause them to be more different or, less accepted or fall behind their peers even more. And you're kind of saying that's not the right lens for the problem. And the lens is really what's going to be the most helpful thing, because in reality, being in the classroom might be helpful a little bit, and being out of the classroom might be helpful a little bit. So it's kind of a day-to-day, where's my student at? What's going to help them right now? Is that what you're kind of saying?
I think that's a perfect summary. I think by saying, where is my child? What is the next step? How do we get them to the next step? If saying, okay, well, sitting in community circle, that is definitely the next step. Great. Okay. Do we need to teach them some attention skills? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So great. That's the intermediary step to get them to the next step. Do we need to teach those steps maybe in another setting? Yes. Okay. So actually there you've got an example of having a student leave the classroom for a small amount of time to be taught specific skills to then re-enter the classroom. I think, like you said, on a day-to-day basis, it changes on the needs. I mean, there's also the big part that, if you're having a student, if your student is being pulled out of the class to work on something specific, they do miss what's going on in the class. Some of the social interaction and engagement with their peers, they will be missing because they'll be working on this specific thing outside of the class. However, you can't have both things, unfortunately, at the same time. You have to decide what you want to focus on. And you might say, actually, I don't want my child to be working on those things outside of the class. I would prefer them to always be in the class. However, just because your child is in the class doesn't necessitate learning. And that's really where you start to look at like the integration model as slightly problematic. We've gone from having our students with learning exceptionalities physically separate, and we said, no, that doesn't work for us. We can't have them physically separate. Then we've gone to having them in the classroom and sometimes out of the classroom. And we said, okay, that sometimes works. But I think when you put someone who learns in a different way into a classroom of mainstream peers, and you're saying that despite the fact that I know you learn in a different manner and style, I'm going to expect you to learn the same as all of your peers. You're actually underserving that child and you're not meeting their needs. And so having them in that classroom, for me personally all the time, that's not inclusion, because you're not looking at a child-centered approach.
Yeah,
that's really interesting that you brought that up in that way. I mean, I think it's kind of a hard point, especially for families to hear, and something that's sad on some level, but I think it's absolutely true. And Hannah and I have both experienced this, where kids who are physically in the room but not engaged with what's happening there.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
From your perspective on does this serve the student, the answer would be no. And so changes should be made in those kind of situations, even if it looks like a step backwards in a way, to have them outside of the room. Did you want to add something to that, Hannah?
No, I was going to say exactly what you were mentioning, is that a lot of the times parents and teachers may think that being physically present in the classroom is inclusion, and that's kind of what they want. And I really liked how Mr. Leach brought this up, was that inclusion can be like that theoretical underpinning because if you want for somebody to be truly included in the classroom is that they're learning together with their peers, they're interacting with their peers, but if it requires them to leave for a little bit and then come back in, there's nothing wrong with that. So I think inclusion looks different for different kids, but the actual physical presence of being in the room doesn't necessitate inclusion right away. So it has to really be looking at the student, what their needs are, what their challenges are, what's the best learning environment for them.
Yep.
And then kind of going from there. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think about Michelle Garcia Winner and social thinking. I've been doing some professional growth on that recently, and it's been fantastic. And learning about the body in the group, which is when our bodies are physically present, sitting with our friends, versus the brain being in the group. Really. And she has some fantastic illustrations where it's a number of students sitting in a circle, and their bodies are all in the group, but each kid is thinking about totally different thing. The teacher's pointing at the globe, and one kid is thinking about a truck, one kid is thinking about a video game. And this happens even with neurotypical children. This is across the board. This happens. So finding a way that we don't equate being physically present as learning, because I think then the danger is that, oh great, well they're in the classroom, we don't have to worry about anything. I think as well, and I liked how you were describing it and talking again about like the benefits to the student, is that we put labels on things like inclusion, integration. We do pull-in model, pull-out model, push-in model. There's all these technical names that we give them, but really when you say what is the best for my child, and you have that open conversation, and you can chunk that down and segment it to tiny weeny timeframes. What is the best for my child this week, today, next week, over the course of the year? But really, what is the best thing for them? I feel like a lot of the questions can be easily answered versus, should we do, well, are we following inclusion if they're integrated, but at 50% of the time they leave school early? It gets very complicated very quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you say that this is a good conversation for parents to sort of spark up at something like an IEP meeting, just to make clear where their expectations are and their priorities? Because there are some parents that I know whose number one priority is their child's academic progress. And there are other parents that I know whose number one priority is being physically present in the room with everyone else. And you cannot guess, knowing a parent, where their priorities are unless you ask them. So would you hope that parents would bring these expectations to you in an IEP meeting?
Yes, there's a new, the Ministry of Education has just released the core competencies, and they'll be updating all of the IEPs along with the core competencies. And there's actually new sections now which really answer, or at least shed light on that. So there are sections on the IEP form where parents can actually express what area. So we were talking earlier, Hina, about, like the communication aspect or the physical or the academic. Parents can now actually say, I think communication is the most important thing for our family and for this child. So parents really start to say, like, these things are the most important. Yeah, I mean, that's something that parents could bring to an IEP, and that would be fabulous. To have a parent come and say, like, we know our child is fine academically, but we think social is what we'd really like to work on, because then the roadmap already starts to be made. We can start to see the kind of destination we want to get to. And I think equally for parents who maybe don't bring that to the meeting, having someone ask them that is really powerful. So saying, what are your hopes? And asking the child as well, if they're old enough and want to be present, what are your hopes? What do you want to work on? And having them give their perspective on the situation.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a lot of information to digest, but I think it could be really helpful for parents who are looking at this big, IEP meeting and wondering how to proceed going into that, or even parents who have had sort of a not great history of IEP meetings in the past and thinking of how they want to change it going forward. So thank you for that sort of breakdown and information. That was really helpful. I'm going to change tracks a little bit and talk about some sort of social side of things. One major priority for a lot of families when they're thinking about their child in school is sort of starting and maintaining peer relationships. And I'm wondering how you view the school's role in this kind of area.
That's a fabulous question, and something that I've been working on in my school and also working on kind of in my own study. So for me, the most important thing for students to have positive peer relationships and authentic, I think that's, for me, that's the key word, authentic peer relationships, is for people to see the child as an expert, or for them to be seen as a whole person. If they're only ever seen as someone that we help, or someone that we, oh, they dropped their drink again, let's pick it up for them. You can never move past that sense of being a helper or a helpee. The other students end up becoming a helpee to the child.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the biggest thing, is showcasing the students' strengths so that they're not seen just in terms of their challenges.
Can you give an example of how, like, what does that look like? Have you had anybody this year that you've been working on that kind of thing?
Yeah. For example, I have there's one student I'm working with, and he has a number of social challenges, and his social interactions with his peers are slightly atypical, and there are sometimes some disagreements about things and some struggling with taking the perspective of others. So he has an incredible memory, and he has an ability to acquire information and then remember that information quicker than anyone I know. And he joined in a Dungeons and Dragons club at lunchtime, and he's like an encyclopedia, and he's amazing. So he's gone from this role of kind of being quite socially awkward to where I can now say, oh, can you help that student? They're just trying to make a new character. And he's like, absolutely. He'll sit down with them, and then he's like, okay, hit points means this means this. And he's able to break it down to them, and he is taking on like a leadership role because of his skill set. So he goes from being someone who's maybe academically fine, but socially very awkward, to now other people are saying like, wow, I can actually engage with him on a level because of his knowledge and his depth of understanding, which is something that wasn't possible before.
So you're saying, like, trying to find some of those opportunities for a bit of a role reversal, where people who are usually the helpee, as you call it, get a chance to like show off what they know and what they're good at, and demonstrate to others that they have these areas of strength, so that other people know how to interact with them more. Absolutely.
And for any student, regardless of their abilities, that we have another student who's in a very developmentally at a very different point, but he likes to help around the school. So one of the things that he does once a week is he does part of the recycling jobs around the school, and he is, other people and other students and other teachers are like, thank you so much for doing that, we really appreciate your role that you are doing. And it is a genuine, authentic connection, as opposed to, oh, it's so nice that this student comes around, and it's the opposite of tokenism, because it's authentically recognizing the other person and what they bring, as opposed to saying, yes, this student has learning exceptionalities, we have to treat them slightly differently, and we have to. I think there's sometimes a danger in just giving high fives and being very positive without there being any substance to that.
Right. Yeah. So finding a real way for somebody to be either to be helpful or to demonstrate,
to be recognized, I think.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah,
and do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would just, as Sam was talking about that, about helping, I mean, it just kind of brought me back to a school visit that I did where the teacher had set up a peer to help the student with Down syndrome with a math problem. So he was having a tough time working on it with his EA. So the teacher immediately recognized, okay, well, like, let's see if Johnny can help you. And immediately it was like the switch turned, and he was more motivated to, work on this super tricky math problem because his peer was helping him. So I feel like, building friendships even within that framework of like helping is a really great way to kind of start that, because then he knows the next time if he needs help or if he wants to go play or hang out with this kid, he can do that because that relationship has kind of been established already. So I think even within the classroom, that's a great way to kind of start the friendship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, fundamentally, there's no problem with being a helper or a helpee. And it's a really good jumping off place for starting a relationship. But I think, are you saying, Mr. Leach, that you liked it to go further than that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think that to be a helper and a helpee is great. But I think that there is a limit to how do you build a friendship with someone if you're just caring for them? Because it's not a reciprocal relationship. Whereas I think if if everyone realizes that everyone has a place, and yes, our roles are slightly different in the school, but everyone is contributing in the way that they can. I think that's very powerful. But I think going back to what we were saying earlier, it has to begin from both sides. So it has to come from a school-wide approach where we accept diversity and we accept identity and we accept different backgrounds. And also that we then provide the student a chance to show their skills.
Yeah.
And, you know, in every class, we're making it very clear that we're all in different places, but we're all doing what we can and bringing what we can to make the classroom and really the world a better place.
Yeah. And I think a lot of parents will often say that, you know, at school, these two, like their child and a peer are interacting really well, but once they're outside of school, like, because within the school environment, it's somewhat of a supported thing, right? The teacher is there to support the interaction or the EA. A lot of parents want to be able to have that student hang out with their kids outside of school, but then it's very difficult if it's not supported. And I'm sure, you know, Marla can also speak to that supported communication piece, but I think that's kind of where the problem starts as well, is that parents don't know how to get that friendship outside of school into, you know, like going to the movies on the weekend or going and playing basketball on the weekend. Like, how do you transition from one space to the next and generalize those skills?
Yeah, I think as well with social interaction, we're learning as a profession and as a 21st century people that social interaction is very nuanced and very complex and based on context. And I think what we've done in the past with a lot of our learners with learning exceptionalities, especially that have social challenges, is we've tried to teach them speeches or scripts. Oh, hello, how are you? Oh, I'm good. Oh, what are your plans on the weekend? I'm going to see a movie. Oh, would you like to come and see? And the problem with these scripts is that they're learned so well, but that's the only option that a lot of our students have. And I think teaching those, the more difficult challenges, like I think about this all the time. So I had one of my students kept asking another student if he wanted to come round to his house. And the student that was being asked didn't want to be rude. So he said no. And then the other kid then asked him again. And so the student he was asking turned away. And instead of reading this body language as like, I'm trying to disengage from this conversation, the student that was asking then walked around to the other side of him then ask him again. And and I realized that what he'd been taught if you ask someone, do you want to come and have a play date with me? If you ask someone that enough times, then, you know, oh, okay, well, I only ask 40 times, but if I ask 60 times, perhaps that is the recipe for success.
Right.
And that will get me a friend. And actually it's really not that simple. But I think giving our students a way to understand, like, oh, we could have a play date, or we can go and do a shared activity together, or we can, you know, oh, we both like this. Okay, let's maybe have a day of playing this.
So are you saying sort of more like in-school clubs or after-school clubs as a way that's like not classroom time to work on those social relationships? So it's a little bit less supported than classroom time, but still not just like out in the weekend time as a good starting point to support those friendships a little further?
I think as well, yeah, I think start it at school, but I think also finding those activities that are similar that students like. I think of Lego or something like that, you know, and if parents discover that the other kid loves Lego, then it'd be like, great, okay, here's a plan. Why don't we can get all our Lego and we can invite your friend round and you can play Lego together. And then they kind of almost give that almost as a package idea to their child, and their child then says to the other kid, hey, would you want to come and play Lego on the weekend, or something along those lines? As opposed to, you know, I think what often happens is we verbally prompt our kids by saying, ask Jimmy to come round on Saturday. And so, you know, the student goes and says, will you come round on Saturday? And Jimmy says, no. And then it falls apart, and there's no reparation. There's no ability to reconnect and pull it back. So I think it's finding a way
more structure, or finding a way to structure it.
Exactly.
What you're saying. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. What would you say to families who are sort of apprehensive about school? Because I think it's a place that has a lot of challenge, and everyone, of course, has their own personal history with being in school when they were younger. So what would you say to people who are apprehensive about that, for either starting school or moving from one grade to the next?
I think the way in which I framed it, especially for a lot of a lot of the learners that have a lot of needs is not making it a comparison between someone else's child and the other children in their classroom, but making it more about how their child is doing based on developmental milestones, or based on, this is where your child is and this is what we're working on next. So for example, if someone was about to enter a kindergarten classroom with their child and they were particularly anxious about it, by looking at that whole picture of the child and thinking, okay, so this is where they've got great strengths. They can work focused for 30 minutes on drawing really detailed pictures. Fabulous. Okay, what are more of the stretches? And not making it so much about, well, those are atypical for the age range, making it more about where is your child and what do we need in order to help them develop. But also understanding that with developmental milestones, we do have an idea about some of the prerequisite skills that we need. I've definitely spoken to lots of parents that are worried, when their child enters school, when we're talking about going backwards. And we talk about going backwards to go forwards and saying, well, if your child is not writing, that's not a problem. But we need to look at what are the prerequisite skills in order to write. Mm-hmm. We need to kind of go back in order to go forward from that point. So I think the biggest thing for me would be for parents to take a breath and not to feel like it needs to be a comparison, that all children come to school with their own unique set of abilities, their own strengths and stretches, and that by just being more calm and not in a place where they feel like they need to compare their own child to the other children, they're going to be able to be more present for their own child.
I think, there's not a way to make it totally unfraught with some apprehension. And I think recognizing that all parents feel some sense of apprehension when their kid is starting school or starting a new grade or whatever, and sort of normalizing that for parents too is a helpful piece of that puzzle, for sure. We would like to know if you have any really sort of exciting and accessible resources that you can recommend for parents and or for students that you think are, great right now.
So I know that Epic Books, especially with what's happening at the moment, Epic Books have just extended free subscription until the end of June. And Epic Books is an online book library that students can access. One of the things that's really nice is you can do Epic Books by age range or by ability, and they have read aloud books.
Cool.
Yeah, you can put it on an iPad and a student could listen to it, and it goes along with the words almost as though it's subtitled, which I really like. So I've been really, really into CBC Kids News. I find that actually I'm surprised that not many people use it, but it has, especially for children in older grades, children that are in grades 5, 6, 7. It has a lot of current content that's really engaging. Like I check it often just to see what's coming up. So they're looking at keywords about what's going on at the moment. But when the Raptors won, they were talking about the Raptor celebration and how Toronto was celebrating, and it's very current and very up to date. So, and kind of a springboard from that, Tar Heel Readers is a fantastic resource. So Tar Heel, Tarheel, it's based from North Carolina. But Tar Heel Readers is a massive compendium of what they're called as PowerPoint books. So people have made books that you can look at online or you can download them. And one of the really nice things about PowerPoint books, and I love literacy, and in terms of, we're talking about what are the students engaged in, if they're not that interested in reading a book, but if you took them on public transit, took photos of them on public transit, and then wrote a book with them, and then you put it into PowerPoint, so you have each slide has one picture of them on different parts of public transit, and then you got to write with them the different things about public transit. I know for so many of my students that's incredibly motivating. They're practically grabbing the laptop off me in order to type the story. So Tar Heel Reader is a fantastic resource for that to use. I know if parents are ever trying to do anything at home and it's slightly challenging, onlinestopwatch.com has a number of different types of basically stopwatch. It's stopwatch kind of apps.
Like time timer kind of thing?
Time is exactly, but there's a sand timer, or there's a different clock countdown, or there's a candle one, or there's a dynamite one, or there's a rubber ducky in a bath. There's a variety of different ones, but I find like having those visuals, I use them in staff meetings. I like to keep myself on track, and having those visuals are fantastic. I do know Go Noodle has become quite popular in my school at the moment as something to use. So I think most of my sources would be literacy based. I think for me, I know now that there's a large amount of things on Facebook and kind of at-home programs that are designed for kids. I'd say for me, this is not maybe necessarily an exact resource, but just being creative with the kids. Being creative and having a sense of like ridiculousness, I find often gets the best results.
Agreed.
Think like games like The Floor is Lava is an absolutely ridiculous game, but actually in terms of a game that you could play very, very easily, you could change it to like, oh no, the floor's a river. And then it's like, oh, let's swim in the river. And then you could kayak in the river, and then you could surf in the river. I think those kind of games where there's a lot of activity and a lot of chance to use verbs and adjectives. And for me, role play is a big, big part. So any activities where you could introduce role play or pretend play would be my suggestion.
Great. Love all those. I really want to check out this timer app. I kind of want to use it for myself now.
I want the ducky.
Yes, exactly. And I think you bring up such a good point. Like, it's good to change things up. It's good to incorporate preferences, especially for our kiddos with Down syndrome. You need to kind of make it fun and change it up and get out of your comfort zone, and just make such a big difference for follow through with some of the more difficult tasks. So
yeah. And I especially think with students with Down syndrome, I think one phrase that I've often heard thrown around quite a lot is stubborn. Students with Down syndrome can be really stubborn. And my take on that, I think about a particular student of mine, is I giggle because I'm like, yeah, it's not so much stubborn. It's just, I want my own way. And actually I found so often, if I inject a bit of humor in that situation and I provide an opportunity for that student to express what it is they need, the stubbornness seems to evaporate.
Yeah.
And I think stubbornness has the opportunity of being labeled as a character trait. And I don't think it's a character trait with our students. I think it's a coping strategy. It's I can't handle what's going on, so I'm shutting down.
Yeah.
I think if we misread that, it comes out as, why is the student so stubborn? And actually, no, it's
Absolutely.
What do we need? How do we need to rethink the situation? So for me, it's always humor. If I can get a smile, I'm like, haha, I've got through,
Mission accomplished. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. For anybody who wants more information on stubbornness, they should definitely check out our episode with Hina, where I interview Hina all about sort of the person, task, and environment sort of framework for thinking about stubbornness. Check that out, and we get into that in detail.
Yeah.
Look at me making ads for our own podcast. Mr. Leach, it's been a pleasure to have you on the LowDOWN podcast today. We really liked hearing your insights, because we don't often get to talk with anybody sort of behind the scenes on how education is set up from a school's perspective. Where are those challenges? What things are easy from the school's perspective in terms of integration or inclusion? And it was really lovely to talk to you.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely.
for coming.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Next week on the LowDOWN, a Down syndrome podcast.
Going back to your question of what parents can expect, you've pointed out too that they can look for and expect to be focusing more early on, not just on words or sentences, or maybe not even speech sounds, but they can expect to be practicing and looking at some of those base interaction skills earlier on. So like you said, working just on joint attention or taking turns and copying each other, paying attention to each other is huge before you can, so that they can learn to even just be paying attention to you, to copy the way that you make sounds, or when you use words, what you're actually referring
for that.
Yeah.
The LowDOWN, the Down syndrome podcast, is a production of Down Syndrome Research Foundation. Learn more at dsof.org and join the conversation at DSOF Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The LowDOWN is hosted by Marla Fodan and Hannah Mahmood, and is produced by Glenn Hughes. The LowDOWN theme music and Just Do was written and recorded by Rick Scott.